work at MIT Sloan as a research fellow. You did this study with Google before the pandemic. You interviewed around 3,200, so more than 3,000 executives. And they said, a fourth of them said that KPIs didn't really align with any of their strategic objectives.
That's correct.
So that was before the pandemic.
Right.
How did that play out after?
I don't think it's gotten much better. I do exec ed and advisory work, and one of the classes I do is KPIs. And it's very, very interesting to see how certain emphases on KPIs has shifted over time. Clearly, some of the retail organizations, which used to be concerned about, sales per square foot, everything shifted to direct to consumer. Who do we partner with for delivery at home? So there was a greater focus on what the P, performance, means during the pandemic and the transition experience. The problem was, and I thought it was a fairly significant problem, is that it was reactive. It was, how do we adjust to these constraints? And one of the reasons why Google asked us to do this research, and why actually I got Google to fund it in this particular way, is because everybody understood pre-pandemic that digital transformation was going to change the way you would instrument your partners, your employees, your channels, your customers, your clients. And so KPIs were going to become a mashup. And just to tie into what we heard in the first session, KPIs were going to have new data streams and work streams so that legacy KPIs were not going to be as valuable. You needed new data and a new genre of KPIs. And I think one of the most important things that the pandemic the pandemic imposed upon people was a recognition that the pre-pandemic metrics we had aren't good enough for the future. The pre-pandemic data and IT systems we had weren't good enough for the future. And so the trick and the challenge is, how do we make KPIs not just an end-of-pipe metric, but an organizing principle for business processes?
So,
and that's interesting to me.
And I should also say that we will open this up for everyone to ask questions. If you guys have questions, we'll take a couple at the very end. We do have an expert in digital economy as well as data here, which is what my next question is really about. Does this all go to say that companies are collecting all the wrong data?
I don't want to say that companies are collecting the wrong data. The issue is, I'll say a slightly provocative thing. If it's now quasi post-pandemic, if your organization is not collecting and processing 10x, an order of magnitude more data now than you did pre-pandemic, you're doing something wrong. The question is, how do you get greater value from 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more data? What kind of analytics do you run to get greater value, greater ROD, return on data? How do you make the mind shift, the organizational shift, and the cultural shift that was alluded to earlier, where it's not just return on assets. If data is an asset, what's your return on data? How do you know? One of the exercises we do in the class is we ask people to ask their direct reports, whether they be CFOs or CMOs, what are your most valuable data sets? Why? How do you know? How would you make them more valuable? Would it be another layer of analytics? Would it be access to new data? Would it be mashing it up with another data set? And unsurprisingly, the top 10% always come up with great answers. The real challenge is the median, the average organizations, it's culturally and operationally hard for them to think of data as an asset. They do something that I beg them not to do, which is they put IT in charge of data because it's data processing, So what finance gets access to is the metadata and the data governance that, to a large extent, IT is responsible for. And that tends not to be a recipe for success.
Well, you've done an interview in the past on how this is causing tensions in the C-suite.
Yes.
And so is that kind of what you're talking about here, one side not talking to the other, or one side being in charge of data that the other side needs?
So we heard GE referenced earlier. They had a great, one of the ways you rose up in the old GE was through the audit track. I see a number of organizations that do the whole data science thing. They have a data science excellence, and they report to the ExCo. I really do wonder if in the next 3 to 5 years, CFOs aren't just going to have quote unquote auditors, but their own kinds of data scientists to audit the data quality, the data lineage, and the models that different aspects of the business use to report results and to justify the investments that they're asking for. You take a KPI like customer lifetime value, CLV. Who should own that? Is it marketing? Is it sales? Is it marketing, sales, and customer success? Or should finance own CLV? Should finance be at the head of the table, primus inter pares in that regard? I have no clue, but it goes right back to the way you asked the question, which is these are the arguments I have the single quote pleasure to eavesdrop on. And most of the time, I keep my mouth shut because they're very serious arguments.
Are you sure?
No, I do talk. Yes. It's the first time we met, she knows me so well. Yes.
We talked once before,
Yeah.
and the other thing that we talked about was who's doing this well. How, in addition to teaching, you advise companies. Are you seeing data used kind of, especially in this post 2020 era, in a way that's more unique and more practical?
I'll give an obvious answer and a less than obvious answer. I mean, I've done work with Amazon pre-pandemic, and they have a strong culture of metrics. The Jeff Bezos line, has your customer had a good day today? Well, what does that mean? What does that mean in 2022? What should it mean in 2025? How do you know? They really take metrics seriously. Some could almost say too seriously. And one of the snaps in the tail an organization like Amazon does is, most legacy organizations are concerned about what? Return on assets. So they have an inside-out approach to KPIs and key performance. Amazon is more of an outside-in. What's the customer experience? Let's design things around the customer experience. And that leads to a different flavor and different emphasis on KPI. The unusual data analytic KPI organization is one that I would wager most of the people in this room indulge in at least a couple of times a week, and that's Starbucks. The Starbucks app, that deep brew, which supports the supply chain, the way when one of the people we interviewed was Kevin Johnson, who not irrelevantly came from Microsoft and Juniper, so he certainly understood the data and analytics and infrastructure side of it. They really took the notion of loyalty, promotion, data-driven, digital-driven customer experience, user experience seriously. How do you connect that to the store? How do you manage, again, the conflict everybody gets to see here, mobile orders and people actually show up? These turn out to be non-trivial operational issues for the organization. And they instrument the baristas, they instrument the machines, they take not just data quality serious, but the analytic layer upon that seriously, and how do you aggregate that? And so the pandemic definitely was a huge driver for them. And for those of us who live in urban cities, in urban areas, what we're seeing is what? The physical footprint of many of the Starbucks declining, and they become more of a pickup place or a drop-in place. But the whole Howard Schultz notion of the third place, where you set up your laptop and you do work all day, that's going to probably change. What enables that? The redefinition of what the purchase and consumption and loyalty experience should be.
So that's an example of a more nimble organization.
Yes.
What about an organization that's making a mistake in the way that they collect their data, that they assess their customers, that they use it at the end?
So my warning system, like that beep we just heard, my warning system is organizations that look at the cloud and digital transformation as the, forgive the cliche, lift and shift, which is, here's our portfolio of key performance indicators. Here are the underlying processes and data that support those processes that go into it. What are the ways that we can lift that up and put it into the cloud so we can do everything that we're doing in the legacy system faster, better, cheaper? You know, my view is, and now I'll flip to the digital transformation side, the purpose of digital transformation is not digital transformation. Digital transformation is a means to an end. What's the end? What do we want digital transformation to enable? What kind of user experiences, customer experiences do we want to facilitate? What kind of collaborations with our partners and suppliers do we want to facilitate? And by the way, how do we know? Well, the answer to the question, how do we know, is key performance indicators, the metrics and measures that we choose. What I think is going to be fundamentally different in the next 3 to 5 years, and you already see this in organizations like, I'm sorry, Google and Amazon, and for the time being, Meta, is you're going to have metrics that are capable of learning. You have machine learning. What happens if customer lifetime value actually could become smart? That actually the customer lifetime value metric could make recommendations about, let's give this customer a discount because that will improve their loyalty, and this customer, let's get rid of them because they're going to be a net loss over time. You know, so that's the kind of intelligent algorithm I see having an impact on legacy metrics.
I'm glad you brought up machine learning,
yeah,
because I think we all know here you're only as good as your inputs.
Garbage in, garbage out, yes.
So with machine learning and AI and all of these amazing technological tools that companies have, you know, what are some key mistakes they have in that input, in what they're putting into the machine so that they get better outcomes?
I don't want to have a technical conversation about, you know, pipeline engineering, et cetera. I think we need to go to an even more basic fundamental than that, which is, and I, you know, a selfish part of me, well, we'll do this when we do the questions. You know, how many organizations take data governance seriously and metadata definition seriously? And if you allow, for the regulated organizations among you, if you allow compliance and the lawyers to own that, you're screwed. If you allow IT to own that, you're also screwed. We have a gentleman with MongoDB, you know, different kind of data types and all this. You know, how do you reconcile the structured data in SQL systems, you know, with unstructured or different kinds of data types? How do you get greater value from that? Should the CFO be in charge of that? No, I think that's BS cray-cray. But should the CFO be one of the people, one of the groups that basically asks people, look at this asset that you have. We have more of it now than we did 6 months ago. How exactly are you getting value from this? Some of you who work with marketing folks, you know about mixed market models, which is how do we, you know, where do we get more return from? Podcasts, the internet, broadcast TV, you know, promotion, what have you. What are the attribution factors here? Well, we're going to see, I think one of the roles that the CFO is going to play is to see when they look at a business process, they're going to say, what are the underlying dynamics, the key drivers, as we heard earlier, to what extent do they contribute, and what kind of new data should we be gathering, different kind of data should we be gathering to improve insight around those drivers. So
one more question from me, and then I'll open it up. And you had made this interesting point about not just the types of data or the future data that is possible, but how the data is transported, stored. With a focus on the cloud, how does that complicate the way that organizations are moving their information?
I would be, people would throw their food at me if I start talking about data meshes. But that's one of the ways that it's going to go. But for those of you who are Netflix and Hulu subscribers who are furious with how things stutter, you know, organizations that invest and double down in, forgive me, data warehouses, data marts, data lakes, you know, where you want certain kinds of ways you gather and collate data, time and cadence, latencies don't matter so much. You're going to be structuring and managing things differently. But if you're doing streaming data like Netflix and Hulu, or if you're doing algol trading, high-frequency trading in Chicago or New York or elsewhere, you need to have a data architecture that supports that. Now, is that also the role of a CFO? No. But if the CFO is not riding herd on how these very expensive and very mission-critical investments, the use cases that you want those things to support, not the technical requirements or the SLAs, the service level agreements, but how do these use cases contribute value to the business while complying with the law and ESG and other metrics that you're using? I think that's an opportunity missed. So I would bet that certainly with the elite organizations I get exposed to, that's where the CFOs and their staff are going to.
Do you have any questions for Mike?
Hi, when you think of the digital economy, what gets you inspired about digital assets?
The vulgar glib answer is not NFTs. The serious answer is I look at stuff in the open source / inner source domain, like GPT-3, the natural language program, GitHub Copilot, DALL-E with prompts for by the way, all stuff that you can pretty much now access and begin to play with. So it's the opportunity of creating low-cost, high-impact ways of exploring how you express yourself or how your team does imagery, does language, explores the future, digital twins, et cetera. So the whole notion of simulating and creating the phrase we discussed in the green room, optionality, that the optionality, really insightful optionality, is becoming a marginal cost rather than a variable cost. And I think that's exciting.
A follow-up if
Sure.
I can. What do you think of cross-border digital asset regulation? Do you think that here in the United Kingdom or here in New York we should have different rules and regulations for digital assets?
So the honest weasel answer I can give you is that MIT doesn't have a law school for a reason. Go to Harvard for that one.
I think we had a question back here also.
Yes, regarding these positive statements regarding data, which is very interesting, will this be part of a redefinition of performance going forward, or has nothing to do with new jargon regarding performance?
Oh no, you're at risk of sounding sycophantic. That's the exact right question, and that's why it's a topic of academic research. How does changing the quantity and quality of data change now I'll use the $94 word, the ontology of performance, okay, the semantics of performance? It's going to fundamentally change.
Going forward, when the Federal Reserve pivots to quantitative easing or expectations of quantitative easing in the future, will this new definition of performance have anything to do with what sectors will be in favor going forward when this easing takes place?
I'm not a macro guy. I'm a university district. I'm a freshwater economist, not my. But do I believe that we are seeing more and more trading models based on the natural trajectory and the unnatural trajectory of regulators, both of monetary supply and of other government constraints? What does optimization within constraints mean? Okay, there's no shortage of great mathematics and algorithms on that. Now we've got, back to the data architecture question that was asked, now we've got real-time data on this. So how will trading and investment be modeled and explored and exploited as the parameters as we seek to optimize within changing constraints. That, I believe, is going to be a future of investment at the firm level and certainly at the PE and hedge fund level. I mean, I'm competent in this area, but Bob Merton won the Nobel Prize, went from MIT to Harvard, shame on him, but we've got a guy, Andy Lowe, in computational finance. There's very good literature, very good work on this. Eric Brynjolfsson, the guy who was one of my colleagues at MIT, is now doing work in this kind of area at Stanford. So there are much better people and very good resource on dealing with exactly the way you've chosen to frame that question. That is a hot topic. NBER has a National Bureau of Economic Research has done a couple of workshops right around the question that you've asked.